He's the president of a company called Nature All Corporation, and he distributes vitamins and food supplements to professional medical people. Gary specializes in his spare time speaking to neighborhood organizations on emergency water purification and sanitation methods. He's written a manual outlining responses for a whole variety of emergencies. This manual has been distributed widely throughout the United States to thousands of people. Jim Phillips will be our first speaker. Jim is an electrical engineer by profession, but he says he's repented of this, and now he's become a professional snow camper. He says that he describes this as a relatively uncrowded field. Jim is a second-generation student of unique cold weather system of clothing, equipment, and doctrine, and he and his father have developed this method. Their system has been taught to and used by thousands of individuals around the world. Their equipment has been to both North America and South America and world-class expeditions. He has taught classes to the U.S. Army, to the Navy, to the Marines, to the emergency medical technicians, to AT&T, and many others. He has created a unique group of classes, and he teaches these classes by video or in person, but he's selling the videos now, classes of such as Surviving Against All Odds, 5 Minutes to Survival, With or Safety Made Real, Without Fire or Shelter, and many others. And he will be in the hall if any of you are interested in learning more about these classes. These two gentlemen are among my very favorite people, and I know that you will enjoy hearing them speak.
It's a pleasure for me to be here and share some concepts and ideas with you. And after that introduction, we wonder where perhaps we are going and what some of the challenges that we have are. Very often I'm asked by people, what do you think is going to happen? What kind of emergencies, what kind of catastrophes, what's going to go on? And I don't get into the business of trying to predict those things, but there's a lot of people that do that very well. Well, what I like to talk about is, well, here's my answer. If somebody asks me, what do you think is going to happen? What I tell them is, I say, if you live long enough, something will happen. I'm sure of that. Something will happen in your life personally, to a community, to a whole region, nationally, globally, I'm not sure, but things do happen. We can get all caught up in this idea about gloom and doom and how terrible things are. Now, there are challenges, and there's some things that must be done, that are critical to be done. But I'm not here to bring a message of how bad things are or how awful they can be, but what you can do and what we can help other people do to be ready. Things happen. And if you're prepared for these things, it's okay. We just have to live through them. Now, I think that's what a lot of life is. Well, perhaps what I would like to title this is Practical Approaches to Making It No Matter What by Solving the Problems of Primitive Living During Very Adverse Conditions. Fancy title, how do you make it when it's tough, when things really go bad, when it all comes down around your ears? That's what I like to help people understand what you can do. A few points that I would like to make. First is this. When we're teaching people about things, or we're teaching them about emergencies, or we're teaching them how to change things, I don't like to do it from a position of what I call the cookbook method, or the recipe. You see, you just take this list of these things and you do this over here and you'll get an end result. Now you say, what's wrong with that? I think the approach that we need to take with people is teaching them the principles of how and why things work. Because I personally believe that if people understand the truth, if you will, if they understand how and why things work, they will figure out what to do. And I believe that no matter what our interest in the area of preparedness or readiness for disasters is, we must understand principles and truth. People will make good decisions if they have good information. That's what was just being talked about a few moments ago. Good information makes the difference. For myself, what I've done is I wrote a series of laws. I call them my laws for well-being and success. And the first one of these laws, and this is the one that I'd like you to perhaps take note of, and I call it a law of provident living. Now, provident living is kind of a fancy term. All that means is if you're doing something to be ready for tomorrow, i.e. making provisions for the future, That is what provident living is all about. What if that future includes tomorrow, next week, next year, next decade, next millennia? If it includes the thoughts, what do I do about cold weather, winter emergencies? If you're doing something today to be ready for it, that is provident living. And here is, now, I just made a point about not wanting to use a cookbook method, which is a list of things. Now I'm going to give you my list that I'm going to give you. But it's a list of principles and concepts rather than a list of things or what to do. This is the law of provident living. There are 4 items in the law of provident living, and there's an order of priority to them that is very important. Number 1 on this list, it is the top of the list, and I like to use the key word. Sometimes I get in trouble for using this key word in some organizations, but I use it anyway. I like to use the key word spiritual. Now, you define that any way that you want. My message is there's more to you than meets the eye. There's more depth of character, capacity, energy, possibilities, and you must nurture that. So that's top of the list. Nothing takes precedence over that. However, number 2 on the list, now this is the one that makes the difference between whether you live or die. When things really get bad, this is the one that will make the difference. I like to use the key word attitude. Now, we hear a lot about attitude and about attitudes. And I don't mean the vernacular one that says, you've got an attitude. I mean about what our emotional response is to what's going on around us, no matter what that situation is. See, attitude is the one that will carry you through. Now, here's the problem. If people look at me and they say, okay, I understand attitude's okay, and that's so vitally important, how do you change attitudes? Here's how you change attitude. You see, it happens to be number 3 on the list. You cannot change an attitude by attacking it directly. Try that with a teenager. I know something about teenager. I have 6 sons, and at one time I had 5 teenage boys all at once. Talk about not planning that one out. I didn't think that one through. But it was an interesting experience. But you see, you don't change attitudes by attacking them directly. You do it by number 3 on my list of provident living, and that is knowledge. Knowledge is the one that makes all the difference. Now, let me give you the correct definition of knowledge, and I believe this is important. And by the way, somebody might be wondering, what in the world does this have to do with cold weather survival? It's principles that make it work. We don't have enough time in this forum. See, I teach a cold weather living class. It's 14 hours long. And we don't have time to jam all of that in here, but some principles will make all the difference, and I want to get these concepts to you. The correct definition of knowledge is this. It is information, and I might say correct information, true information. It is information multiplied by experience. You see, knowledge is something that becomes a part of you. It's something that you live with. It's something that's inside of you. And by that definition, you can have bad knowledge, you can have good knowledge. Remember, I said it's information, correct information, truth, multiplied by experience. You see, we become what we live. And then last on this list, and this is where everybody wants to spend all their time and their money in this idea of preparation and readiness or emergency survival. They want to spend it on number 4, but this happens to be the bottom of the list. I call that the things, the material things. You see, very often I'm asked by somebody, tell me what I need to buy, I'll go buy it, and then I'll be okay. Now, we are taught that by the advertising people and by the marketing people that that's how it works. And this is my message to people in terms of safety or survivability. First off, you're not safe because of what you own. Just ownership of things is not enough. You see, if people put their safety or their survivability based on the fact that they own a 72-hour kit or an emergency kit, or they have a basement full of some stuff, what is their attitude going to be when those things are taken away from them or destroyed, or they are caught in a situation where they are not located where their stuff is? If the formula is, I'm safe because I have this stuff, when I don't have this stuff, then I must be unsafe. I guess I'm going to die. And my message is this: you're not safe because of what you own. You're safe because of what's in here, in your head, what's in your heart, your values and who you are, and what's at your fingertips in terms of your skills and ability and how to apply that knowledge that you have. That's what makes you safe. Now, the more general message is this: you're not a person of worth because of what you own. You're a person of worth because of what's in here in your head, what's in your heart, and what you can do with your hands. and your skill and your knowledge and your abilities. Rather than what we're being told, which is you're a person of worth because of what you buy, chew, smoke, eat, drink, drive, live in, whatever it is, that somehow you'll be a better person and you'll be appreciated or loved more. The message is you're safe or you're a person of value because of what's inside of you. Now that's why I come from a principle base. Okay, let me give you now a principle that's more of the physical things. And people say, all right, but what do we do? So here's what I call wilderness wisdom. Wilderness wisdom, and there are 4 points to this principle, and there's an order of priority. By the way, I said that previously, number 1 through number 4, the first being spiritual, the second being attitude, knowledge, and finally the material things. That is the order. You must have all 4 of those for quality of life, or even just to live. It is the same order of priority that we have with wilderness wisdom in these 4 items. Now, we're getting right down to the physical, material things. I'm leaving out the emotional, the psychological, the spiritual, and all those things. We're just talking purely physical things here. And if you'll boil down your life right now and in what it takes to survive or live, you'll find that it's only really these 4 things. In fact, it's really only number 1 and number 2. Number 1 on this list, top of the priority, is clothing. I don't know if you've heard that before, but that's the top of the list. If people want to be prepared, it's clothing first. Secondly on this list is nutrition. And let me give you a very simple definition of nutrition, being water plus food in that order of priority. Now, if you're making a list, you can put a dotted line right there, and these 2 items above the dotted line, I call them the prepared necessities. If you want to be prepared, you need to have those 2 items. And you say, well, that's a pretty small list. Well, it is, but you need to understand it's a little broader than that, because let's take the issue of water. When I say water, I'm not talking about just a handful of water, which you can put in your mouth. It's everything that it takes to secure, to purify, to contain and have an adequate supply of water. That's what the definition of water is. As it would be with food, as it would be with clothing. So you have to understand the depth that's behind these things. Now, so those 2 items are the prepared necessities. Number 3 on this list is shelter. And number 4 is fire at the very bottom of the list. Now that sounds upside down from some classes or courses that are taught, because they spend a lot of time talking about fire and about shelter and not very much about clothing, and of course they talk about food, but they miss the importance of water very often. Why is that list given the way that it is of those principles? Think about it. In very adverse conditions, what stands between you and expiration, death? Let me give you this. Here's a fancy name. We might call it a personal mobile environmental climate protection device. What is that? That's clothing. That's all this. It's personal shelter. It's something that you have with you. And depending on what the conditions are that you're facing, that clothing is what stands between you and hypothermia, frostbite, or some of the ugly things that can happen. So clothing is extremely important. Why is it the top of the list? Well, in adverse conditions, and by the way, if you're prepared for the worst of conditions, and you're comfortable with them, no pun intended, but you're comfortable with them, then when things are a little easier, like right now, should we have a catastrophe, just an 8.9 earthquake and puts everything on the ground in this valley, there is no shelter left. You're going to be outside. And you say, well, that's not too big of a deal right now. Is there some kind of a universal law that says that earthquakes only come in good weather? They will never occur in January. That's out of the rule book somehow. You see, what happens if that earthquake or that catastrophe comes in the middle of night, in the middle of January, in the middle of a blizzard, and it puts everything to the ground? What are you going to have that you can use? The only thing you have will be clothing. And you see, the reason clothing is at the top of the list is because within just a few moments, a few minutes, maybe an hour or 2, you can be severely threatened and or die. In some of the conditions I spent time in, you have maybe 3 or 4 minutes, if you're dressed like I'm dressed right now, and then you're dead. Wind chill factors of 120 below zero, you have moments. I spend time in that, or just 60 below in sensible air temperature. You don't have very long. Now, most of the time we're not exposed to those things for very long, but you don't have to be exposed very long to be in trouble. So clothing is the top of the list. It must be right. Now, number 2, I talked about being nutrition, being water plus food. Why that order of priority? Well, you see, it takes a while to starve to death. It really does. Now, most of us get rather uncomfortable after we miss a meal or two. I have gone 10 days without eating. The first 3 are the tough ones. After you get day number 4, you really don't care. The energy level's down a little bit if you have water. But if you do not have water, at the end of 3 days, if conditions are just average like they are right now, you're in big trouble. If the conditions are severe, meaning perhaps high heat, or something that most people do not recognize, which is kind of my specialty, is cold weather. See, when the temperatures get like 10 degrees or colder, your need for water increases significantly. You dehydrate very rapidly in the cold. And the colder it gets, the more rapidly you dehydrate. And if you don't make up for that water, you've got a problem. As a matter of fact, the concept that I teach to people is this, that the primary trigger to hypothermia in the cold is dehydration. You see, when we go out in the cold, we're probably going to wear some kind of clothing. I mean, we're just not going to go out there and drop dead from the cold in 5 minutes. But if you are not consuming an adequate supply of water, you become dehydrated. You can no longer produce, your metabolism falls off, if you will. You can't properly use water circulation, all those things in a very complex system that we are. And you end up in trouble in a hurry, in a matter of just a few hours, half a day at 0 without consuming water, and you may have lost up to 1 or 2% of body weight in water, and you will be in serious trouble. So there's a whole message in that. That's the reason for the order of priority. It's clothing, it's nutrition, water plus food in that order. Number 3 being shelter, number 4 being fire. Why are shelter and fire at the bottom of the list? They're not reliable. Clothing is with you. That's why it needs to be in that way. Well, concepts of what do we do? First off, one of the problems that we have in the industry, or you as a consumer or somebody who's trying to help people be prepared, is that we go out and very often we try and rely upon the hang tags that are in the store. So it brings up an issue in my mind about performance rating on clothing. Now, any of you that have some, and particularly if you have some extensive outdoor experience, but even if you just have a mild amount of outdoor experience, and you bought this stuff that somebody sold you, and they told you that it was going to, it was going to be great at 0 or 10 below or 20 below, what was the end result half the time of using that stuff? You probably come away with me wondering, who in the world did they get to test this stuff, and where on earth did they come up with these numbers they put on the hang tag? Because you buy one of these 20 below 0 sleeping bags, you use it at 10 above, and you freeze your hiney off. And as you see, it's a lack of understanding within the industry and within people. So one of the things I try to do in these classes, and I think we all need to be doing, is teaching principles of how and why things work, so people can make a proper evaluation, forget the advertising tag, take a look at what the thing is made out of and how it's made, and based on your knowledge, what is knowledge? Information multiplied by experience, you can look at it and say, you've got to be kidding me when you read the tag. I do that a lot when I read these tags. I says, not a chance on that. An illustration. I've done a lot of extensive testing and evaluation, design and developing, engineering, if you will, in this area. And let's take a look at some footwear and what some people might have to say about them. Here's something that you may recognize, one of these snowpack kind of boots. This boot is officially rated by the manufacturer as being rated for 40 below 0. That's what the hang tag says on this thing. Here's another one by the manufacturer. Some of you military may recognize this. This is rated as being good for 60 below 0. And you say, well, that sounds good. You take a look at those things. In fact, one catalog calls this a 70 below 0 boot. Now, how do these really perform in the real world? Well, I'll just give you some figures very, very briefly based on some extensive testing that I've done. And this is at 30 below 0, sedentary, people just sitting and measuring actual foot temperatures. I used to wonder about the industry and said, how do you put numbers on this? And they said, well, we put a copper foot in this and we tie it to a computer, and then they set it in a temperature of 30 degrees above 0, and then the computer tells them what the clo value is, and then that gives you, you can say it's good for 40 below 0, 60 below 0. And I'm going like, what in the world does a copper foot have to do with my foot? My conclusion is not much. Take a look at this. In the testing that we do, controlled conditions, this boot at 30 below zero, sedentary, foot temperature drops by 24 degrees per hour. You start out usually around 88 degrees for a foot temperature, for a toe temperature, skin temperature, and it's going to drop 24 degrees per hour. Where's that going to be in 2 hours? In trouble. This one loses at the rate of 16 degrees per hour. That means in one test at the end of 45 minutes, we had a foot temperature of 49 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know if you have a concept of what that feels like. It is not pleasant. It hurts like crazy is what the bottom line is. This one at the end of 90 minutes, you had a foot temperature of 45 degrees. And this is 60 below zero boot. Here's one. It's rated for 60 below zero. I know something about it. I designed it. And I teach people how to make things like this. So who puts the numbers on them? I call this a 60 below zero boot because I use it at 60 below zero and my feet stay warm. In the same test we're talking about here, the foot temperature drops approximately 1 degree per hour for the first 2 hours, and then it just stabilizes and stays there. So at the end of an hour and a half or so, with this footwear right here, you have a foot temperature that dropped by 1 degree. There's a big difference. You see, these temperature ratings on things can be very dubious. You have to be very careful with them. Well, this whole thing started with, many years ago, by the way, I chuckle about this sometimes, having done a lot of traveling, you're sitting on a plane, some of you do this, and somebody turns to you and say, what do you do? You know, and I say, I'm a professional snow camper. They usually dig for the airline magazine in desperation because they don't want to talk to this crazy man, because who on earth wants to be a professional snow camper? It all began many years ago. This is the 1962 vintage of that big black boot that you just saw right here. This is where it started, where you can solve the cold foot problems. And you might get the idea that if you can solve the cold foot problems, the rest of the body is a snap. That's the bottom line. That's what we found too. Once you could get the feet taken care of, the rest of the body wasn't all that hard, although there's a lot of things you have to understand how to do that. Let me give you concepts of what is possible. You can live outside 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for as long as you need to or choose to or want to or have to, where the temperatures may never rise above zero. Now I talk about the extremes, just get the idea. A lot of people are not going to be exposed at below zero or 10 or 20 or 30 below zero. That's fine. But if you can be prepared for those extremes, whatever they may be for you, the rest of the time is easy. Look for the extremes. Take care of that. The rest of it will be easy. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the temperature's never above zero, and you live outside without any necessity for fire or shelter. Remember, I put fire and shelter at the bottom of the list because they're totally unreliable. Some of the conditions I find myself in, and some of the conditions I see other people thrown into, fire is not an option. You see, what does it do to your attitude if you said, look, I have to have fire to stay warm, dry, be comfortable, and take care of my nutritional needs. I have to. It's the only way that things work, and we're kind of conditioned to think that way, thermostat on the wall and the whole thing, or camping stoves or those kinds of things. We've been taught to think that way. And now then you can't have those things. What'll that do to your attitude? It shoots it all to heck. And remember, people do not die primarily from the lack of things. They first die from lack of attitude. In fact, that's one of my big messages. People quit. They give up. They stop. One of the big problems that we have within this industry of safety and preparation and survival is that we've got a bunch of people running around selling, and I'm not exactly negative on this, but I want people to understand the implications. They're running around selling kits. If not a kit, just a list of stuff. And what they're saying is if you buy this kit or if you put things together from this list, you'll be okay. But those kits and those lists have some big holes in them. First off, they never talk about clothing except you need a wool blanket, you know, and you better have some warm clothing. That's it, if they say that amount. And they say very little about water other than you need to have some. And those are the two most important things in terms of the order of priority, in terms of your term of survivability. And so these kits and these lists set people up to be in trouble, particularly if conditions are poor. You know, Middle of the night, middle of January, middle of a blizzard, and there you got your little 72-hour kit, that you run outside with, or you find yourself outside with, and you're trying to get along, and it ain't going very well. You thought you had it all solved, therefore you felt good, and now then you've got a problem with wife and children and yourself, and it's not going very well at all. That will blow the heck out of your attitude. You're in worse condition in some cases to have had one of these inadequate kits than the guy who has nothing, because the guy who thought he had it solved and it now went worse than he could even possibly imagine, he just gives up and says, I don't have a clue what to do. And when you say you don't have a clue what to do, guess what? The mind believes that, so I don't know what to do. So you sit down, and people die because they quit. The most important thing we've got to teach them is more about attitude than about things. But how do you help them with the attitude? You teach them about how and why things work so they can create whatever they need no matter what. And that's what I try to get through to students and people that I work with, is I want you to understand how and why it works, so that if your kid is destroyed, lost, or goes away somehow, you're going to look around and say, oh, I don't have what I really, really would like to have, but that's okay, because I know how it works. What do I have around me that will substitute? And you go to work to solve the problem rather than saying, I don't know what to do, and quit. That's why attitude is so critical in all kinds of survival, including just make it in what we call this normal world out there that looks a little strange to me. It's a little warped. But it's your attitude that will get you through, because otherwise, if you don't have the proper attitude, you just quit and say, well, there's nothing we can do. I guess we're just going to flush it all. That's not true. It's true if you believe it's true, but it's not true, absolutely. That's what I want people to understand. Well, it's possible to go through extremely severe conditions, and winter being one of those that most people think about the most. And you're going to do it with clothing. Now, how do you do that? You have to understand the principles of how and why things work. And it'll let you live outside, as I talk about. Well, what's one of the most severe things, or one of the most deadly things that people face in that environment out there in an emergency situation that happens to be getting wet? Well, that's where we say, well, you have to have a shelter and you have to have fire. Well, I just said maybe you can't have shelter and fire. Now what are you going to do? See, that's where the clothing has to be right. It has to work with the laws of physics to make it come through. Personal experience, I've gained a little bit of, shall we call it, notoriety. There's some legends in certain circles that float around about me, and I will not own up to some of them because I hardly recognize them as I travel around, but it's curious to see how that happens. But here a number of years ago, I was challenged. I was doing a newspaper interview and talking about, living no fire, no shelter, and you don't use waterproofing. That's one of the rules, by the way. Waterproofing is deadly. And talking about how and why insulations work and what's the true performance of clothing and how you can build your own things and you don't have to spend a lot of money. And if you get yourself damp and wet, it'll self-dry. And they came back to this concept, you mean you can get wet and you'll be okay? And I said, yes. And then this interview that lasted for a couple hours with these writers and editors, in there they kept coming back to the concept, you mean you can get wet at below zero and be okay? And I said, yes. Now their concept of wet and my concept of wet were just a little bit different. You have to learn how a newspaper writer works, is what I figured out. Because as we got to the end of that interview, they said, Mr. Phillips, we would love to do a story on you. Here's what we would like you to do. We would like you to go to one of our frozen lakes. This was in January. We want you to go to one of our frozen lakes, chop a hole in the ice, and then with your homemade, unwaterproof clothing, get yourself wet, and then come out of that hole in the ice and spend the night with no fire, no shelter. Would you be willing to do that? And I said, well, okay. Then they asked me, have you ever done that before? And I said, is that normal human behavior? They agreed that it was not. I never thought about trying. Why on earth would you do that? That's crazy. But yet I have immersed a foot. You break through the ice and you immerse a foot. And see, my idea of getting wet is some environmental wetting, some sweating and those things. So we went and did that. 8 degrees above zero, slight breeze blowing, 18 inches of ice on the lake, water temperature is 32 degrees, no waterproofing, and I made this clothing the day before I did this thing. Went out there, let myself down in a hole in the ice. You go up to your shoulder, to your armpits here, and I spent 15 minutes in the water. Now, by the way, this is one of those things, this is done by trained professionals, don't do this at home. This is a dumb idea, folks. When 32-degree water runs through that clothing, it hurts. We did not have a video of that one. It would be hilarious to watch. And oh boy, talk about gasping for air. As a matter of fact, the diaphragm locks. I couldn't even breathe for a minute. I thought I was going to die of suffocation, let alone hypothermia. But I did put myself into hypothermia, 15 minutes in the water. It gives you some cold water protection. Got out of the water, squeezed the water out of the clothing, and just went active by walking around. Spent the night, no fire, no shelter. And by the way, I am not tough. I'm a bigger wimp than probably anybody in this room in the cold. I really am, because I know I don't have to put up with misery, although this was kind of miserable. And in the morning, the clothing is dry. Now, we are doing something special here. All we're doing is obeying the rules. And most of the clothing and the things that are out there do not obey the rules. They're done by habit, they're done by tradition, they're done by momentum, they're done by marketing, and they don't pay any attention to how and why things really work. That's the kind of thing you can do. Now, with people that I've worked with since and we've helped to outfit, we've had accidental immersions at 20 below zero in Alaska, one in the Arctic Ocean at 50 below zero out of a boat with some Eskimos, that their attitude was when this man went into the water, he is a dead man. Don't even bother to fish him out of the sea, because you don't survive at 50 below zero after you immerse your clothing unless you have a change of clothing and shelter and fire. And they fished him out of the sea, squeezed the water out of him, he went a little bit active, and he was okay. There's been some other situations where life-saving with a man, an Iditarod racer, using this clothing technology that I teach people to do. And he lost the trail. He was a front runner in the race in 1991. And got off the trail. He parked his sled and set the anchor so he could go out there hunting for the trail. They travel in some ugly conditions, and if you have the right clothing, you really travel ugly. The dogs bolted, pulled the anchor, and took off. And the only thing he had was his set of clothing, and my doctrine is you always have it on you. Your mittens are always attached, your hat is always with you, and those things. The sled took off. He has no sleeping bag or anything. It is 20 below zero, and it has been going to 50 below zero, and he has only his daily wear clothing on. His comment after the race was, he says, if I had been using my regular clothing, is I would have suffered frostbite and hypothermia at least. The clothing saved my life. Or another man who had a medical emergency on a hunting trip, had a heart attack, and he was isolated, and he had to crawl for all afternoon, could barely move, in severe pain, crawl back to the cabin to get help. The temperatures were below freezing, but he happened to have the kind of thermal protection on in this clothing. And as I took a look at him, he says, it's a miracle that you live, because in those kinds of stressful situations, and some of you people understand that very well, that hypothermia would have been an easy thing to set in, and that extra stress would have done it. He says, the clothing saved my life. So see, clothing can save lives. How do you do that? You have to understand these laws. We're talking about the laws of heat transfer and fluid flow, body metabolism, health, physical response to the cold. That's a fun one. I love to teach people about that, because if you understand how the body responds to the cold and how and why clothing works, you can figure out how to make a system out of it that'll do some spectacular things. The actual performance of clothing and materials, insulations and fabrics, and how and why they work, and how does moisture and heat transfer through these things. And you see, you have to do all of this in an atmosphere or thought of understand, not individual static laws, if you will, or rules, but see, it's all very dynamic in the environment and with the body and the clothing, and everything moves and changes temperatures and winds and all those things. What I'm saying is this: you don't do it on a laboratory bench. You do it in the laboratory of life. Bench tests help you eliminate things that are obviously terrible, but you never know. People will ask me, and now here's a criteria. You're saying, what do I do? What do I do? How do I help people? If I need to carry a message to them, people say, how do I know my clothing is right? It's real simple. See, they're wanting some kind of a formula. They're wanting a list. Here's how you do it. Now, right now, you can't do this test, but come January, many of you can. You take your emergency clothing or whatever it is that you think that you're going to use, and you remember that lawn chair that you put away, you get it out. And then you go outside. I would prefer the temperatures to be colder than 10 degrees. I really prefer them to be below zero. But you put on all of this clothing and you go out in the lawn chair and you sit sedentary for 4 hours. If you're still comfortable after 4 hours, you can say, I think I'm on the right track. If after 10 minutes you're in severe pain, you have a problem. Admit it. You've got to fix it. It's a very simple test. And people say, yes, but I can stay warm if I just run and keep moving. Well, there's incidences of people that have been caught on snowmobiles out there, and they do in fact survive by walking all day and all night for a day and a half or 2 days. How many days can you stay up running and walking? Not enough in some cases. You've got to have the clothing. Here are the clothing principles very quickly as we wrap up. You have to, number one, we're going to break all of the standard rules. Why? Because all the people using the standard rules and making that stuff, they're freezing their heinies off. They don't have the answer. So we're going to break the rules according to them. We're just going to obey the real rules and things will work. We're not going to use any cotton. Cotton is deadly in the winter. I'm so serious about that in clothing that I make that we use in very severe conditions. I don't even use cotton thread to sew it together. But certainly no cotton inside the clothing, no long johns or any of those kinds of things. The worst possible insulation you can use is cotton thermal underwear. It's got the right name, thermal underwear, but the stuff is deadly, and I mean that literally. It will kill you. No cotton, wool, or down. We eliminate them all. People say, yeah, but wool, that's traditional. Yeah, I know it's traditional. And if your choice is between cotton or wool, wool's great compared to cotton. Wool compared to the synthetics that you can use is terrible because of its moisture handling characteristics. Now, it's much better than cotton, but still, compared to what you can do with the synthetics, it's very poor. We do not use waterproofing. Why? Well, this is a fun principle. I wish I had time to go into some of these things because they're really neat. If you understand the laws of how and why things work, it's like, oh, now I get why I've been cold and wet all the time. You see, you've already got the experience. Most people have bad experience with cold weather. They just need some information so they can say, oh, is that how it works? Now I understand. So you can take experience that you've already had, turn it into knowledge very quickly just with the correct information. No waterproofing because it traps water inside. What about waterproof breathable? They're not breathable enough. That's the bottom line, without being able to spend a lot of time on that. We're going to use only synthetic and uncoated fabrics to cover this stuff with. They're going to be very tightly woven so the wind doesn't blow through them. By the way, there are some special applications for waterproofing. If it's raining outside, let's just not have it soak into the clothing. But if it's below zero, or well below freezing, is there any liquid water out there generally in the environment? It's all snow, right, or ice? Ice is dry. It's sand, it's dust. How do you get wet from snow? Here's a principle. This is so simple that everybody misses it. You say, but I go outside, and in the cold and the wet, in the cold and then the snow, and I get wet. And then what happens when you get wet? Well, you get cold. You turn into a popsicle in a hurry because of moisture, how quickly it transmits heat. So you say, so I must waterproof when I go out on the snow so I don't get wet from the snow. Well, the waterproofing will trap the moisture inside, so it's kind of like the Christmas turkey that bastes in its own juices, except in this case you will freeze in your own juices. It takes a little while for it to build up, but you will freeze because of the own moisture buildup inside the clothing. How do you get wet from the snow? It's frozen, it's dry. You warm it up. So here's the principle. Stop melting snow with body heat, which means you insulate adequately. That's all. That's how you stay dry. And then you have the breathability, the right materials. You see, the principles are simple. We're going to insulate now in the case of what I teach people to do because it's very user doable. We're talking about teaching people the doctrine they can learn themselves, the understanding of these things, along with the skill of how you do these things. So what we teach people to do is we're going to insulate with open cell polyurethane foam. It's an organized matrix that performs so much better than fibers. It's wonderful compared to fibers. It'll outperform anything else in the world. That's the bottom line. If I could find something better, I would use it. And what I'd be glad to do, and if there's people that have interest, oh, by the way, the other thing is we've got to understand the proper doctrine for nutrition, which is extremely important as a part of this. And people can live through extremely adverse conditions, and I don't mean do it with just misery and suffering, I mean to do it comfortably. Now, there's a table of a bunch of goofy looking stuff out there, things that I've made, and if people have questions, I'll be glad to spend a little bit of time with you and answer some things, all those things are for touch and feel out there, and I got some tags on them. Take a look at things if you like, and it may stimulate some thought within you. And it's a fun thing to do and be involved in some of these things and teaching people how to really do some spectacular things, and you can learn how to do that. You can teach people how to do those kinds of things. Also, if you'd like more information, I have a little sheet out there, and if you put your name on it, it'll be on a mailing list, and there's some check off if you want some stuff. I'll be glad to send some things to you, answer your questions. And as I close and get ready for Gary to come up, just this concept of water that I touched on very briefly, which is extremely important, and that's a 4-hour subject in itself, quite frankly. And I mentioned that already, that if you don't have adequate supplies of water in the extremes, you're going to be in trouble. But one other thing that's very, very important to consider is it's not just an adequate supply of water that's important, but it's the quality of that water. Because an amoebic dysentery or giardia or any of those things that you can have in an emergency situation is one of the most devastating things that can happen to you, and you can die from it. It's tough enough when conditions are good and when you have treatment, but if you're out there on your own and there is no help and there is no medication and there is no hospital, the just simple diarrhea is extremely deadly. So quality of water is very important that people have to learn how to take care of, both in storage of some expedient water, but then how do you process water from there. So with that and these thoughts, and I appreciate the time to share some crazy ideas with you from a goofy guy who does snow camping for a living, I would invite Gary to come up and talk about this issue of water, which is very, very critical. Thank you very much.